Welcome everybody to 7A's podcast. Today we're joined by VexxingCat and Cantankerous. Today we'll be talking about a couple of things. One of them that we're starting with is gender roles. So with that, I open the floor to all of our guests. How do you think that gender roles are perceived today, and how do you think they're influencing things like various media outlets and that kind of thing, especially in North America since that's where we're based?
I guess I'll open the floor. Hi, VexxingCat here. So I think that gender roles really affect society as far as what we, encompass to be a range of behaviors and attitudes and how we treat individuals based on like, hey, you're a boy, you need to man up, versus a girl, it's like, no, 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 you don't want to play with that. That's for boys. I'm a little bit older. I'm 35. So for me, like I grew up where like it was more commonly understood that girls got Barbies and boys got like, toy guns or, played cowboys and Indians and that sort of thing. I was very lucky. I was very artistic. I got to play with gender neutral toys like Lego. So for me, like, I identify as a woman, feel like I'm a woman, and I'm very, very lucky that I'm cisgendered. But as far as like femininity, it depends on what I'm going to be doing. But I am a feminist, but only because I'm an egalitarian. I do feel like there needs to be equality between the sexes. But as far as individual gender roles, it gets a little bit murky because now in society, like kids should be able to play with whatever the heck they want to play with. So I guess confused why it's become such a big deal that boys are boys and girls are girls in this modern society.
I wonder if this notion of boys having to be masculine, cisgendered interpretations of what their parents deem to be the right representation for their particular gender, is that something that is becoming more enforced now in society, given the proliferation of the various nuances to gender constructs that we have now? I wonder if the folks who consider gender to be heteronormative are becoming more inclined to be strict and more stringent about enforcing those ideals because they don't want to see their kids swaying from the constructs that are supposed to be cis.
Yeah, I have to wonder if, like, when abusive behaviors or manipulative behaviors take place, if we dismiss them as just boys being boys, if that's not in itself kind of like problematic. Like, it's a weird dismissive rhetoric to use. You know what I mean? Like, to say, like, well, this will just happen. You just have to grit and bear it. Like, it's like, no, this is something that has historically made people like me, like women, uncomfortable, in the locker room. But you can't just say it's the way that men act in the locker room because that's just saying that it's acceptable.
I do understand what you mean, and this question is kind of put forth to those people who are cis gendered, identifying themselves as the gender that they're, physically. I forget the word. Is it because they fear that their kids are not going to be the heteronormative way that they're supposed to be? Would it be better for the kids to grow up with certain degree of stringent rules and paradigms within which they have to formulate themselves? Or is it better for them to be kind of thrown into the society and being like, okay, these are your options. You can choose within this set whatever you want to be. Your sexual organs don't define who you are, and your sexual identity is not determined by the organs that you possess at birth. So I kind of would like to hear somebody else's opinion here, because I see that Danny was talking about how he enforces it more with his kids than he would normally because of the proliferation of this idea.
Well, we've got a shout out from Whiskey and Bourbon here. I'll just read out what he wrote. Growing up personally, those constructs affected me quite a bit, and I did grow up in an abusive household from both my mother and father, and was kind of forced to just toughen up and be a man, and never show my feelings, which is a male sort of enforcement of masculinity, leading to some terrible mental health within myself. I don't know. Maybe I'm misinterpreting the question. So I think you're really hitting the nail on the head, Whiskey. In like it's the question, is it biological, in which case you were born male and then there's these inherent gender norms that come from that, or alternatively, it's a social construct. So, like, if you look at photos or paintings of young children back in like the 17th century, we're talking like kings were dressed up like little girls in frilly lace and pink fabric and great white wigs. And there wasn't as much of a to do on like what your child was wearing. Whereas in modern society, if you put a little boy in a dress, heaven help you, all the mothers are like, oh, you're gonna mess him up, he's not gonna know that he's a boy. I mean, by modern evolutionary psychology theories, like, most children learn to categorize themselves by the age of 3.
Hmm.
And that's because we're like giving them the toys, giving them the clothes that define who they are by our standards, not how they define themselves. And so an aspect of role theory or gender theory is that treating these differing distributions of women and men into roles based on their primary organs that they have in their pants impacts their behavior and like psychological and social processes. Like, realistically, boys are learn to like be physical and like socially like strong and have dexterity, whereas girls learn to present themselves as objects to be viewed. Like, they're not as outspoken, they're not as fiercely competitive, because, oh, no, 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 honey, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You want to get married someday, you want to have children someday, and those are the values that are instilled in women versus men. So it's very interesting. Let me go back here. We've got so Danny was talking about the ideas of nature versus nurture, about being sure to make sure his kids are not influenced by gender fluid trending, which I understand. I mean, Danny, you're about as manly man as it gets. So instilling in your own sons that masculinity that is so strong in yourself, that take charge attitude, is respectable. There's nothing wrong with that.
Amongst the first waves was the idea that, like, if you're born a man and you transition, it doesn't matter at what point you're at in the transition that you were born a man, so you're not fully accepted into this cycle of experience of life. At the same time that is like kind of pushing back, I think there are also people that think like, hey, when I was growing up, things were this way, and right now it just seems like with all of this gender fluid stuff, there's not as strong of a compass for raising your kids, kind of speak. There is something to be said for that, I think, because it doesn't have the institutions of raising our kids are not as strong. Either there's more of those, or maybe having a spectrum instead of like this categorical way of thinking is less impactful upon the youth. But I also, like, from my own perspective, I would push back against that and say like, hey, it's more like everybody has their own experience in the world. The idea that hardship produces empathy and suffering produces more connectivity and that kind of thing. We're realizing that there's more than just these experiences that have existed. But it can be difficult as a parent, I think, to navigate all this, especially raising your kid in a time that's different from how you grew up.
Personally, I mean, being a single child, the only child of my parents, and being raised in a family with a lot of cousins who were primarily girls, because I was the older one amongst the younger kids, I was kind of raised to be more of a go getter, more typically masculine ideals. I dressed like boys. I wore mostly shorts and pants over dresses and skirts. Somehow it makes me wonder, are the masculine ideals held at a higher standing because of the way in which we treat those ideals? Is it just considered to be better? Maybe that's why it's okay for a girl to dress more masculine, but it's frowned upon for a guy to dress more feminine.
Let me address some comments here by Diablo, who's joined us. So he said, I feel like it's not 100% of the case due to the fact that some women are really competitive. So that's directly addressing what I had mentioned earlier. And that they want to be better than their male counterparts. Therefore, the high school female kicker at his school, I assume, wants to go pro and wants to play in the NFL. So I feel that's not always the case, but with sports, it's a bit different. You're right. Honestly, Diablo, in my high school growing up, I mean, this is like in the early 2000s, there were no female football players at any of my high schools anywhere in my state. So it's a very different thing. Like now it's been almost 20 years. So yes, more girls are getting into these sports. The girls only played volleyball, soccer, or softball. Those were the three main sports that women played in high school. And then he went on to say, and on the point of how they have to dress, that's a 50-50, because yes, some women like to dress up and show themselves as proud of who they are, and some like to dress in shorts and t-shirts. These are situational decisions. You're right on the money. It doesn't always mean that nature and nurture comes into play, like Danny previously said, but I completely understand what he meant, but I still feel like it's always going to be the person's choice, not what people around them think. I don't think you realize how society treats women. Women are expected to be thin. They're expected to groom themselves well. Even if they don't dress up, they still have to have their hair just so. It has to be clean, washed. It has to be, combed out properly. If you have messy hair, you're going to get side eye from all the other women that you work with or go to school with. It could be. Now, Diablo says maybe it's just me. Now, guys can get away with a lot. I mean, how many guys do you know went to school in the same t-shirt 3 days in a row? And they didn't care because it didn't matter. For guys, it's a very different thing because it's more about what you're physically able to do and what you're mentally able to do. But that kind of goes hand in hand with hyperfemininity and hypermasculinity. So hyperfemininity is the exaggeration of stereotypical behavior that's believed to be feminine. So your physical appearance, what you do for a job, your domestic behaviors, and your personality traits. Hyperfeminine people tend to exaggerate qualities that they believe to be feminine. That includes being very passive, naive, soft-spoken, flirtatious, graceful, nurturing, those types of things. Versus hypermasculinity is the exaggeration of behavior that's believed to be masculine. Men, like hypermasculine men, exaggerate those qualities that they believe to be masculine, like being very competitive, dominate women, date lots of women, be very aggressive, worldly, experimental with their sexuality, non-sensitive, physically imposing. Like they want to bulk up so they can feel more masculine. So I do feel like there are certain aspects of being like masculine that we don't necessarily have to like get rid of. Cause like, I love me a man, honey. No question. So the idea that a man has to stop being a man to be attractive, that's kind of ridiculous. I think that might also tie into, though, realistically, chemically, women have been taking birth control for however long, and it's been scientifically proven that women that are on birth control for extended periods of time find more feminine men to be more attractive, which I think is interesting. I personally am not on birth control, so give me that rugged lumberjack of a man.
Okay, just really quick, I want to touch on the idea of like the dichotomous relationship. In China, which is not the United States, but just as an example of how these things interact with each other, you basically had men and women as a yin and yang relationship, and yin and yang is gendered in Chinese philosophy. You had like the feminine quarters, which were the inner quarters, like the household, the domestic quarters, and then men had the outside quarters. So basically, women weren't able to walk outside in public without a male escort, or if they were, it was because they were on their way to somewhere, or they would like huddle together in chapels to go engage in gossip. This was the one safe place that was outside the home for them. They had their own fashion too. So there's men's fashion, women's fashion. Gradually, men's fashion became more feminine as time went on, which edged women to become more hyper feminine. At the same time, like navigating this, you had to reinstill in men masculinity. So while they're claiming feminine fashion and this type of thing, they're still engaging in the same patriarchal rhetoric that they've always had. And so it kind of further polarizes the society. And I think this is kind of unhealthy, and I can see this happening here in the States right now. And I think that, discussions of gender have happened for ages. I just think that the current dialogue we're having kind of reflects this way of like a push and pull that isn't necessarily conducive to a healthy conversation from any side. Like, it's just, I think it might be a little bit too contentious. Yes, like if you're abandoning a ship or trying to preserve your nation, women and children first, because that's the procreativity that you want. It's literally the future generations that you're seeking to preserve. Men are clearly expendable. That's why men were the first to be in the draft. Also, against the idea of social utility is the oppression of women, the dismissiveness of feminine roles, the exaggeration of how emotional women can be versus men, that they are not fit for leadership positions, that they're not deserving of these administrative roles or any kind of upper level of responsibility, and ultimately of histrionics, that a woman can be hysterical, that if she's overly emotional or responsive to any of these things, that that's an emotional response that is outside of logic and needs to be repressed and institutionalized. This is clearly something that goes against the grain of what is ultimately useful to society, of having more feet on the ground to vote with versus like just exercising power. And I think that's where we come into the idea of gender roles.
I agree with you, but just for the sake of the argument, let's look at certain matriarchal systems. Because, I mean, if you look
Yeah.
at ancient India or ancient, I mean, in this valley region, really, if you look at that entire region, historically, you will see a lot more matriarchal societies and civilizations or villages, whatever you want to call it, kind of popping up throughout the area. It kind of lends as a counter argument to current way of looking at women or femininity, which is, like you mentioned, it's looking at it as if it's more emotional, unstable, unable to make firm decisions because of whatever hormonal reason you want to cite at it. That matriarchy itself is like telling all of those arguments that they are null and void because they existed and they worked and they flourished. And even to a degree, there were certain civilizations that were actually polyamorous, not just polygamous. It was the women who had partners that they slept with. They didn't really marry one man. There was no primary relationship, there was no secondary relationship. It was just whoever they wanted to be with that night.
Let me go ahead and bring us back real quick, Cantankerous.
Mhm.
So Jeremis here, he made another comment. I know it's historical perspective, but would it still be applicable? Something tells me that the unwashed peasant masses of China were not subject to the same gender role norms as the nobility in the court of the nobility. And this is directed at Ginger. Of course, I'm not an expert on ancient China, though, so there is that.
So, two things. One is Jeremis. Thanks for joining us. Would you like to say anything before I respond to you?
Nah, go for it. I was just throwing a point out there. Hey, everybody.
So the time period that I'm discussing of China, I'm not necessarily saying that it was monolithic or that it's in any way like the same as what we experienced on this end of the globe. I am saying that the relationship between masculinity and femininity and the roles and categories described and how things are dictated, that there's this relationship, it's a push and pull between them, and that it became increasingly polarized to the point that both sides were sort of hyper emphasized in their own. It's sort of like in the same vein as the way that Victorians dictated gender roles, because men would sort of take on feminine aspects to seem more sophisticated, and in doing so forced feminine aspects to be further feminized to the point that women were just repressing themselves and masculinity was like just this dominant aggrandized thing. All my point was at bringing this up was to just talk about the relationship between these gender roles and maybe the fact that there's an unhealthy relationship that might exist sometimes depending on how you go about discussing them. I didn't mean to equivocate or state anything generally. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying now. I know you said it kind of like polarized, but how I'm kind of trying to figure out how to wrap my head around masculinity becoming.
In China, they still had an Empress Dowager. They still had like literally one of the best pirates in all of history is recognized as being a female pirate from China. Like she would take over enemy pirate colonies and consolidate them into her own. I don't know of many pirates that did that. So like she's like nobilized as one of the best pirates ever. At the
Yeah.
same time, in that same period, the way that women dressed and interacted and went out in society, it's like considered that they weren't given positions of power because they were discriminated against because they were thought of as being emotional or lacking the capacity to make these decisions, or they had biological things like, menstruation or pregnancy that prevented them from making these decisions consistently. And so they were prevented from having these positions of power. And so that basically let masculine roles, men, more autonomy over them. You know what I mean? Like it's just this kind of line of thinking that I'm like, okay, how do these roles really interact? Like if they both have equal footing, then why is it that one is able to wipe the rug from under the other like this? Because it's just an interesting relationship in my mind.
Kind of to lend to your point, Ginger, there are traditionally in a lot of Asian cultures, like you mentioned in China, the idea of a woman was to be more of a domestic housekeeper, the women to basically take care of the children. But within that, there was a certain degree of power that was afforded. I believe it is mostly a North American or European concept where even though women are expected to take care of the house and the home, power that comes with maintaining the finances or being able to watch over the estate that I've seen in a lot of Asian cultures to be there for the women. They have a way
Mhm.
of making their decisions known to their male equivalents and counterparts, and they are not afforded the same prestige and same respect in a lot of European and North American settings. And I don't mean fundamentally, I don't know why that is. I suspect there's a reason.
Yeah, I noticed like in India, especially China, the mother-in-law has command of the household. But let's start talking about some fun stuff.
Feel like we could literally unpack and segue beautifully into the duality of gender roles.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. There's so many lines you can draw.
Realistically, in my own work, in audio erotica circuit, some guys want to be told that they're naughty little boys, and some guys want me to be the more submissive guy kind of girl. And it just kind of depends on the person what they want to hear.
I know I'm a submissive with dudes, right? But like this year, I realized I'm sub with women in a way that I didn't know before. Because like my last relationship, I was not sub, and so but it's like a very awkward thing because I think about your side of the coin all the time, and I'm like, what's it like for somebody to like come across dudes on the internet, especially that are just like, yeah, I'm into this. It's like cool. I mean. That's cool that you're into that. Like, I'm into this other stuff. I just make content. What's it like for you as a content creator to come across this stuff? Is it like something you enjoy or is it sometimes uncomfortable?
Some of both. More often than not, it's common practice. The uncomfortable stuff is when I get like sent content that's a bit off-putting. Like one
Yeah.
time I was basically a human doll and my legs and arms and head could pop off of my torso. That was kind of a weird acting gig, but that was their kink. And I'm like, it's not that scary. My own personal proclivities, like I'm a 50-50 switch. Like every time I take that test, the BDSM test online, it's always 50-50. Like sometimes I want to be that really delicate, submissive girl and have the guy overpower me and show me a good time. And sometimes I want to have them bent over my lap and spank their bottoms red. It just depends on my day and depending on my mood. Because there are some men that really want me to wear like some 6-inch, 8-inch long like heels and step on.
Yeah, the closest I'll get is you can use me as a footstool, but I have nothing to do with your feet. Nothing. They look like hands that developed wrong. Like it's just
Well, I know for a fact that if I come to visit Tank, it's going to be all out war and it's going to be a blast.
It's going to be a tug of war, Vex.
honestly, I think if I were in the same room
Mm.
as both of you, I'd forever mute myself. So okay, so here's the thing, right? Like my last relationship was a year long. It was really chill. It was like an equal partnership. So there wasn't any kind of like there was no dynamic. It wasn't like a format or like a BDSM type thing. But I do like BDSM and we did like occasionally we would like role play or do something interesting, and it was like something spicy that would be, it was just fun, you know. I didn't realize because like that relationship was several years ago, and I joined 7A like this year. And at some point in 7A, like I received an order from a woman. Yeah, okay. And then I did it. And I was like, whoa, like I didn't realize. It was just such a surprise. Yeah, I guess I'm just sharing this out of the blue, but like it's just such a surprise to come across stuff you didn't even know was out there. Have you guys had anything that like you didn't think you were into or realize you were into that you just like come across and it's like a surprise like that?
Well, I actually did. With me, it was my switch side, like my submissive side.
Mhm.
One of my first girlfriends I'd ever had, she was a dominant, and like we did some BDSM stuff, but not like full on. And until, because she really wanted me to be submissive for her, but I was like, I don't really know. And then I went more towards the dom side, but it was just a bad relationship, so it ended anyway. And that, regardless, but it was actually on a separate server, which I came to 7A because I met someone in that server who was a friend of mine because that other server was really just kind of toxic. And I discovered that I have a very, very submissive side. And I was like, wow, like I always found myself being more like, oh, dominant, DDLG daddy, like master slave stuff, da 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 da. I sort of experienced being submissive and little and other things. It just sort of clicked with me, you know? And I was like, wow, this is really fun. I enjoy this. But I still enjoy this.
I firmly believe that sexuality is a continuum. You keep learning things about yourself and you keep discovering things about yourself, and that's how you find pleasure as you get older, because it really is just like a lazy river. You gotta slowly make your way through it.
Yeah, like so I went to this wedding last year in Wisconsin. It was a friend's wedding and a lot of us friends just shared this big Airbnb. That's all fine. Like it was a really cool experience, like a bunch of friends in one house. And this one girl, she came to the wedding as well, and you know, she was staying at somewhere else, like some other house or Airbnb or something like this. Anyway, last night she's there. We had been flirting the whole time she was there, and then she's like, "Oh, I want to stay here tonight." And she was dropping all these hints at me, but I was like, "This is one of my best friend's weddings. Like, I don't know what's going on. I don't want to screw this up. So I'll just like go ahead and or watching like TV. Everyone else has gone to bed. She's right next to me, and then she puts a blanket over us, and she's like, "All right." And then she like made a move, and I was like, you know, I didn't expect any of this. She just kind of commanded the whole thing because I obviously was not going to make the move back. I was nervous. And at that time, I was just like, I'm still me and confident, and I'm still like, you know, I'll pin you up against a wall or whatever. But like in this moment, like having someone make the move on me, like I was just really into it. And I was like, I don't know, it was just so different from anything I was like raised to know that I was like, oh, this is new. Um, it's just new and exciting and awesome. You know what I mean? Like it's very rare to find that kind of stuff now. I mean, I'm 29, so I've got some years under my belt, but not the most. It's interesting to not have that come across you in that amount of time, you know?
Well, so it looks like Jeremis was kind enough to take the BDSM test. If you're listening, I highly recommend all of you. Now, I personally have been involved in BDSM for quite some time. I take my BDSM test probably every 6 months because during that time, either my partner may have changed or my experience may have changed. I recommend all of you do the same. As far as exploring some of the things that I like to do, either side of the rope is sexy as fuck. I like to watch, I like to tie, and I love to be tied. So I do believe I'm listening to Cantankerous get all flustered and excited over there. So if you would like to take the floor, Miss Rope Queen.
Uh,
No,
oh
no one is
gosh.
surprised by my results, by the way. I'm 99% Brett. Everybody knows.
Yes,
So I
I'm
just
well
saw a
aware of that,
triple nine
Ginger.
percent. I just want people to look at mine and have a look at how many fucking 100% are there.
Yep, it's like the first 10% of your result there. You're full on into a lot of things.
Just really quickly, the BDSM bot that we have in our channels here on 7A, is exclusive to our server, which is a unique feature that we have.
It's pretty unique bot that I believe was coded. It is verbatim question for question, the same as the BDSM test.org. It's fantastic. I mean, I love it. And what's great is it has a running dialogue of everyone that's completed the test. So you can actually like check other people's stats that you're into. And I hate to say that 7A is a little bit of a hookup server, but it is. It is lovely to see what other people are into.
So what's interesting is I've taken the MBTI year by year, and I've gone from ENTJ to ENFJ sometimes, but mostly I test ENTJ. With the BDSM test, I have never, like literally, it has never happened that I have never been less than 99% brat.
I used to be an INTJ, and then I became an ENTJ, and I haven't changed in 10 plus years.
Yeah, we did it. We had to do it in my high school psychology class. We had to do it.
Right.
Can't remember what my result was though.
I just want to take a moment to thank all of our humble listeners and participants. The input that we got was really extraordinary. Obviously our conversation wouldn't have been what it was without you guys taking part in the sidelines, so it's really cool to include all of y'all. I hope that everybody that was here at least tunes in next time as well.